Hello, everyone. Welcome to the University of Toronto Joint Centre for Bioethics Seminar Series. My name is Andrea Bianchi, and I'll be the moderator for today's session. Our speakers today are Dr. Anne Heesters and Jason Lesandrini, and this seminar is entitled, Can Legal Theory Save the Life of Healthcare Ethics? A chat about the practice of practicing healthcare ethicists. Before I introduce today's speakers, I'd like to let you know that the seminar is being recorded. This lecture, along with other archive lectures, can be accessed through the Joint Center for Bioethics YouTube page. The format of our seminar today is a presentation by our speakers, followed by a facilitated discussion period. And in advance of introducing the speakers, I would like to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto and I operate. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island, and I am grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. Now, it is my absolute pleasure to introduce today's speakers. Dr. Anne Heesters is the Senior Director of Clinical and Organizational Ethics at the University Health Network and an Assistant Professor at the Dalla Lana School of Public Health, where she co-directs the capstone course in the Masters of Health Sciences program at the University of Toronto's Joint Centre for Bioethics. She has recently joined the Institute for Education Research, or TIER, as a clinical investigator too, and is an Academy Scholar at the Wilson Center of U of T, where she looks forward to foregoing exciting new relationships and reuniting with her old love, education and education research. Anne has practiced in the field of bioethics for more than 20 years and established ethics services in 2 Canadian provinces. Anne has an abiding interest in professionalizing the work of healthcare ethicists and was a founding member of Practising Healthcare Ethicists Exploring Professionalization, or FEEP, and an early director of FACHE, the Canadian Association of Practising Healthcare Ethicists. Her recent book, How Legal Theory Can Save the Life of Healthcare Ethics, is an exploration of ethics, objectivity, and conflict of interest in the context of a pluralistic society. Anne is a student of philosophy and generally endorses Ronald Dworkin's view that absolute confidence or clarity is the privilege of fools and fanatics. Jason Lesandrini is the Assistant Vice President for Ethics, Advanced Care Planning, Spiritual Health, and Language Access Services for Wellstar Health System, an integrated healthcare system in the United States. He is faculty at Mercer University in South College, where he teaches ethics to physician assistants. Like Anne, Jason has practiced ethics for over 20 years, including working at Grady Health System, a large urban academic medical center in downtown Atlanta, the Veterans Health Administration's National Center for Healthcare Ethics, and St. John's Mercy, a Catholic health system near St. Louis, Missouri. He has worked on numerous national committees for the development of clinical ethicists and has been an expert to a number of professional organizations on ethics-related issues. So Anne and Jason, on behalf of the Joint Center for Bioethics, welcome to today's seminar. I'm very excited to learn from you. And so everyone tuning in knows there aren't any slides. This will be one of the wonderful fireside chat type of seminars that we are privileged to listen to. Take it away.
Well, thanks, Andrea. And Anne, thank you for inviting me and for this opportunity to sort of engage in this conversation with you about the topic of can legal theory save bioethics. And so, as Andrea said, I'd like to start us off really in a conversation together, really maybe with your input on what's the general idea or the thesis you're trying to show us in this book? What are you trying to teach the community of practicing ethicists about?
You know how to cut to the chase, Jason. Yeah, I'd like to warm myself up to that question and first just say that if we were doing this as a PowerPoint, I'd declare I'd have a conflict of interest slide and the usual things. And if I could start there, if you don't mind, I'm going to let you know that I don't have any commercial relationships to disclose. I'm not going to prescribe anything because I'm not a medical doctor. But I am a director of an ethics program in a large Canadian hospital, and I know you lead an ethics program too. And I do have views about ethical issues. And I think everybody here does. And I don't think that's a matter of shame. I think that that is a matter of interest. So practicing healthcare ethicist, I'm not a lawyer or a philosopher of law, even though my book is called How Legal Theory Can Save the Life of Healthcare Ethics. And I once aspired to be a philosopher of law. And this presentation isn't legal advice, of course. But, you know, having been a PHE or practicing healthcare ethicist, I don't think you use that PHE designation in the States, for 20 years, sometimes as a solo ethicist, sometimes in community with others, I've thought about these questions an awful lot, and I've tried to practice with integrity, and I've tried to think about some of the charges that some of the skeptics of the field have leveled against us. And the best way for me to make sense of those charges and to make sense of what I do for a living, what I'm doing when I'm doing what I'm doing, to use Bill Harvey's phrase. He was one of the founders of the Joint Center, and I think everybody in our community cites Bill Harvey. I decided I'd have to write about it. You know, I don't know what I think until I see what I say. So, you know, I guess that my thinking about ethics practice is informed by my disciplinary background. So I'm a student of philosophy, as Andrea said earlier on. That does affect how I approach the work. I felt the sting of some of the critiques of the field, and one of them, and if I may just ask for your patience for a moment, I'm going to quote one of those critics of the field. And that is someone known to many of us, Giles Schofield, who's asked this question. He asks why the field continues to be plagued by the problem of describing, explaining, and justifying how and why it is that others should seek its expert advice. He asserts in a paper, by the way, called What, If Anything, Sets Limits to Clinical Ethics Consultants' Expertise. He says that ethics consultation is a field which, for some mysterious reason, seems to be in perpetual need of having its life saved. So that felt like, you know, a bit of a, throwing down, like that he was throwing down the gauntlet. And I thought, yeah, I think that's a fair question. What, you know, there's more to that quotation. The status of clinical ethics consultation is both a practical and a political problem. Its power and authority demands domestication because there's an undeniable tension between what he calls its epistocratic ambitions and the foundational values of a democratic society. And, you know, I didn't think his charges were new ones. We've heard them in different forms from various people. And my title, by the way, isn't just about Giles. It's probably, it's about an article that probably most of us are very, very familiar with. And that was Toulmin's famous article, which I tried to remind. I wrote this thing, you know, back in 2019. And I thought, do I still love this article? How Medicine Saved the Life of Ethics. And Toulmin was talking about the 1960s, you know, the early part of the 20th century. Moral philosophers were engaged in these dry discussions, you know, about the language of morality. They were failing to weigh into substantive moral issues. They said it wasn't their business to do that. It was really kind of a linguistic game. But medicine changed that. We got invited to the table. And in the 1960s, people were really, you know, demanding that people take sides on substantive moral issues. It was a time of great tumult. So really the title of my book is a riff on Toulmin, How Medicine Saved the Life of Ethics. And I think there's an opportunity now for a collision between medicine, bioethics, and another world, which is legal theory or philosophy of law, and our own field. So that's a long answer to your short question, but I hope it gets us oriented to the topic.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you're right. The thing I will add, in the States, at least, there were, I think in Canada as well, lots of sort of factors that were influencing why ethics was being invited to the table. And I think there were probably ethicists who were pushing to be at the table as well. It wasn't just hey, come join. It's we were maybe in a negative way saying we have to be there with an uncertainty that I think your work tries to tackle about what are you doing when you're here, and what does it mean, and how are you even adding any value that goes on here. So I think that's what I would say. I think, and I've read your work, and we've talked extensively about it, and I've read a lot of the things that you mentioned in there by Giles and Carl Elliott and Toulmin. And one thing that seems to stand out to me a lot in the book is this notion about role confusion, and it seems to be super key for you. I'm curious, maybe if you could, for the audience and for me, rehash with me a little bit about what that work is doing, what overview for you, how that role confusion problem creates or impacts maybe the work that happens on a daily basis for ethics, or PHEs, as you would say in Canada. We don't say that. I've not heard that said down here, but maybe we do, and I just don't know the lingo. But maybe if you could just sort of give us a little on your sense on role confusion, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some interesting work on that topic. There's some empirical work done by Paula Chidwick and Andrea Frolick, who are two of our colleagues here in Toronto, where they interviewed a number of ethicists about what they perceive to be conflict of interest in their role. I also see it in some of the critics of the field, where they say, ethicists are compromised and ineffectual in their work. And in fact, I actually try to knit together the critics of the arguments of the critics in the field and describe what I think their complaints are about us. And one is that conflict of interest thing. And if I may, the three things I think we've been charged with are being compromised and ineffectual, which I think is a complaint about conflict of interest. And that is that those who pay our salaries, right, kind of, the piper plays the tune, right? We can't be watchdogs when we're really lapdogs. That's a kind of a Carl Elliott move, but I don't think he's the only one. That our work is politicized and anti-democratic, and it's sort of us really covertly imposing our own view of the good on those we serve. And the third thread that I try to pull on in the book is that the idea that the charge that our work is incoherent in the context of value pluralism, because we know we live in a pluralist society. So you're asking me about number one of those three, which is that we're compromised and ineffectual. I don't argue that we're never conflicted. And of course we can be. And I don't argue that we don't hold political views on controversial topics. I think we do. We have to, like everybody. I don't think we have the inside track or the right answers to all hard questions arising in healthcare. And I don't argue that we should be moral philosophers, really. But I do think that getting clear on the kinds of conflict of interest that might be a threat to our integrity is a really important thing for us to do. And I don't know if you remember, but there's this wonderful quotation from Andrew Stark, who's one of the folks who's very prominent in the field of conflict of interest. And he says, in Tolstoyan fashion, conflicts of interest arrive from, I should back up. He starts with Anna Karenina, where he says, all happy families are alike, and each unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. Right. And then he says, in Tolstoyan fashion, conflicts of interest arising from out of role sources, that is the threat of money corrupting our practice. That's all alike. Every profession has that threat to integrity, but every profession expresses its in-role conflicts in its own way. And I thought, what an interesting claim that is. So the threat that people throw out there that, Jason, your hospital pays you to be a vice president of ethics, and that's a threat to your integrity. Well, I don't think that's a greater threat or a different threat than anybody else who earns a living. And I actually think there are some countervailing forces that make it not the big worry that it might be. But I do think the in-role conflicts, and I can describe those, the type 1 conflicts, which are when a professional occupies more than one role with respect to the same principle or the same party, can be conflictual. Ethicists face that all the time. So we get a call about a case and they say, I need your advice about Mrs. Bianchi. I'm looking at Andrea's name here, so it leaps to mind, about patient Bianchi, who's actually really problematic, right? She's non-adherent to treatment and so forth. She's yelling at all the staff. But then we get a call. We get a call from Ms. Bianchi or Dr. Bianchi herself, and we hear another side of the story. I don't think in any part of my training, anybody has prepared me for the fact that I played the same role with respect to multiple actors in complex cases. And managing expectations when we come into a consult, understanding that we're not in an agency relationship as lawyers might have representing a client. That's not the kind of role we have. I think we know it instinctively, but I don't think we have standards of practice that describe how best to manage those, those in-role conflicts very well. The other problem is that we have to exercise the same role. Oh, sorry, that was with respect to the same principle. We can also have multiple roles. Sorry, it's multiple, like the same commitment to all those people in that consult, but we could also have a case where we have multiple roles with respect to one party, and the threat to integrity there, for example, is akin to, for example, a physician investigator who is charged with the care of a patient, but also has a duty to scientific integrity. I think ethicists can have dual roles like that too. We might mistake our patient for a really interesting case that we might want to write up in the literature, and we may not pause enough to think about how to do that work well. So I think our in-role conflicts are the part where we get tripped up. And then the third thing I would say about that is that this is where legal theory comes in, is if we think of ourselves as sort of more akin to the role of a judge, a literary critic, any party whose role is to be disinterested rather than to advocate for one party in a complicated interaction, we have a better handle on what we ought to be doing when we're doing what we're doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it comes to mind, a question comes to mind about how that sort of, this idea of a judge and the notion of legal theory sort of saves us from us. So I want to pause on that for just a second. But I think in your first point is pretty poignant, and I think it needs to sort of be said again. I wonder what, and I'd be curious your sense, I have some thoughts on this too, but I wonder what people who are antagonists to the profession of clinical ethics or healthcare ethics or PHEs would say about people like judges, right? What is their charge against judges? You know, how, if we are somehow advocating for our own conception, aren't they required in some sense to throw the baby with the bathwater out? Because now how does anything in legal theory actually, in judicial hearings work? Everybody is bringing something to the table. And I don't think, I think you can disagree with me on this. I don't think there's a single ethicist I know who doesn't think they bring their own baggage. Those who don't are naive, maybe junior in the field, or maybe not have been sort of through an appropriate training program or even practice actual clinical ethics. You know, maybe someone who sits in a role of ethics but never goes to the bedside, never interacts with, is sort of a telephonic based method, and never really engages in the what I would call the practice of doing clinical ethics. So I'm curious if you have thoughts about whether you think these arguments make us have to throw the whole legal system out too at the same time, and then maybe if you can, what's your sense about that? And I'll be quiet for just a second.
That's interesting the way you framed that. Yeah, after I finished the work, and it was actually with the publisher, you had some pretty controversial legal cases south of the border. And I thought, do I have to rethink everything I've said? Right. But I actually thought, no, I think there's a way of handling this. First of all, legal theory didn't just grind to a halt because you had a politicized court.
That's right.
And people had good discussions about what it means for judges to practice with integrity, right? And it doesn't mean, by the way, that judges don't have values. Judges don't have to interpret legal materials. Of course they do. And in fact, that is one of the interesting topics in legal theory, is what judicial discretion consists of. Like how should judges decide in what the great Herbert Hart called, H.L.A. Hart, who was one of the great legal positivist scholars, said, cases that exist in the penumbral cases, hard cases. What we forget when we focus on hard cases, that most of them aren't hard cases. Most cases are pretty straightforward. We know when we're speeding, we know what the speed limit is, and we know when we've broken the law, and they don't rise to this level of discussion. And I don't think everything we do, by the way, in bioethics or as practicing healthcare ethicists is hard case either. And I actually have a taxonomy of cases in the book as well. And I think there are some that could rightly be described as penumbral, where actually the ethicist's own values do come to play. And I think it would be better that we were honest about it, and that we have an account of what I call theoretical disagreement in bioethics. That exists. And legal scholars have that. There's feminist bioethics, right? There are natural lawyers, there are positivists, there are critical legal theorists, there are people who say, how a case gets decided has to do with what the judge had for dinner. But people also have accounts of what integrity in judging looks like, right? How to use legal materials. What do you do with precedents and rules and principles? How do you weigh those materials? And it becomes important that judges engage in the right way in argumentation and reason giving. And I actually think that occasionally that's our job. And it may actually be a job for someone like you more often than someone like me, because if you're charged with making decisions about the mission of your hospital, or whether a particular policy or strategy is consistent with the values that you purport to hold, then I think you have to engage in those conversations. And I think it would be foolish to say, Jason doesn't have any values. Like, I have no view on this about the good life. I think it's about coming up with arguments that best fit and justify the social practice you're in. And I borrow that account from Ronald Dworkin, the legal theorist, when he argues for what he calls law's integrity.
Yeah, and this makes me think of many conversations we've had over the time about the practice of clinical ethics and the work that clinical ethicists are doing. And in particular, it makes me think about note writing. And I hear a lot in what you're saying about these cases of penumbra. And listen, I don't want to sound like the Anne cheerleader, but I think you're onto something here. I think what you're arguing for seems to be on the right path. I think one thing that I think a lot about, and had a lot of conversations with you, but also with others, is about people writing recommendations into charts. I think the standard practice would say that people ought to, but I wonder how you think about recommendations in charts, what those kinds of things should look like. I tell you from a practice that I've built up here in the States and worked for numerous organizations. I've never ran into a practice where people didn't want recommendations, nor didn't think that the people who were sort of offering those recommendations weren't being transparent in the recommendations, right? I think what I've often heard and what we taught is, to your point, is there may be another way to think about this problem. There may be another answer that might be ethically justifiable. But when I look at the arguments as they're presented and trained in philosophical discourse and methods of engaging stakeholders and getting background information and clarifying values and doing the work that I think we both think we're doing, this is the thing I think is supportable in this situation. And so I'm curious how you think about that, especially in light of, and maybe you would think this might be a role miscalculation on the behalf of other people, but I've heard it in our field said a lot that when clinicians call you or a team member calls you, they're often not asking you to list out all the things that could be done, right? They're asking you for what should we do here? Like, how do we resolve this tension? What do we do here? And so I'm curious how the work that you've done in legal theory and the savior of legal theory that you're proposing it is, what that says to you and how you think about recommendations, the practical side of recommendations.
Oh, wow. So that's really interesting that you bring up the chart note as an opportunity for discretion. I actually think strong discretion, as legal theorists would describe it, is probably rarely applicable in a chart note. So I'm sorry to disappoint. I actually think it's more likely that people are going to say, Jason or Anne, what do you think we ought to do about this program or whatever? I think that's when we're asked to give an argument that fits and justifies the practice we're in. With respect to patient cases, however, I really think we need to foreground the values of the patient. We have to identify who the appropriate decision makers are. I suppose sometimes we can narrow the field. Core competencies talks about that, right? Some things are so ethically problematic that we just take them off the table. And in that case, I don't think it's exercising discretion. It's actually, identifying for people what the ethical standards are that apply to the case. Mm-hmm. So I actually hadn't really thought of it quite the way you put it. And I actually even, because I am a student of Ronald Dworkin, and that won't be meaningful to a lot of people here, but he has this idea of the superhuman judge, Hercules, right, who deals with hard cases. And Hercules knows all of the law, and he has superhuman powers of reasoning and all the time in the world, which we don't, right? Dworkin actually believes that Hercules doesn't have strong discretion, because if you reason well enough, you're going to get the right answer. This is a longer conversation. I actually substitute a different ideal typification, as you know. I introduced PHE McLaughlin, who's my ideal type. And Canadians will recognize that as the name of our former Supreme Court Justice. But what I wanted to do is say, PHEs aren't superhuman. And we actually work on cases with other people. Like, there's a whole court there, and there are other people giving evidence, and there are people who can bring empirical understanding of a case at hand and so forth. So I think in the really complex cases, which may be policy related cases or using accountability for reasonableness to come up with a strategy around a tough question of priority setting, that's when people want to know, what do you really think, Jason? Like, what are the principles we should be considering? And I think we think with others. So it's actually not quite as straightforward, and I'm sorry I can't, encapsulate it as neatly as I'd like.
No.
I hadn't thought about it in the chart. chart example, to be honest. I actually don't think we have much strong discretion there. I think we're very constrained. And even Judge Hercules is constrained by, the requirement that he seek the right moral answer to those hard cases. And that's a whole other complicated story.
Of course. No, fair enough. Well, and then it sounds like, so it sounds like to me, there's this notion in your book, and you've sort of hinted at it here so far today, not hinted at, today you've hinted at it clearly, it's spelled out in the book, about this conception of moral spaces. And you note it multiple times, I think, in the book, and I think you were getting at that in a little way of what you were talking about when you're engaging with patients and providers about opening that moral space. But I will tell you, I've read the work of the moral spaces work that's been done, and I will say I sometimes struggle a little bit to follow it and what it's actually doing. And so I'm wondering if you can explain to the group, and maybe to me again, so I can be refreshed about what that work of moral spaces does for you in your sort of work, and how you think it helps to contribute to the justification of our practice.
Yeah, great question. And I probably can't do Margaret Urban Walker justice here. I mean, I do reference her idea of moral spaces. And I that's because I think it's important that we recognize that ethics work is relational work. It's not just about, weighing some kind of abstract principle without a sense of context, without a sense of responsibility to one another, without understanding that ethics work is relational. I think that's important. Joan Tronto is someone else I draw in the book a little bit, she rejects this sort of what she calls a crude engineering model, which is what some people describe principlism as, right? The idea that we somehow argue from principles to these outcomes without recognizing the complexity and the messiness of the context that we're in, and without attention to power relationships. So I think that's what some of these thinkers bring into the conversation. And the other feminist bioethicist whose work I reference is Susan Sherwin. And if we go back to the earlier sort of conflict of interest conversation, she urges us to reject the idea of bioethics, as she calls it, as a shell game. Right, where we're distracted by this carnival barker shell game where we only answer the very narrow question that's put to us without thinking about the question behind the question. And I'm sure you've said that to yourself before too. Why is someone calling me today? What's the real question that they want answered? What's really at stake and for whom? And the other part that I think she draws out really beautifully in her writing is the idea that sometimes what we spend our time doing, this is the COI, not the fish COI, the conflict of interest COI, sometimes we spend an awful lot of time chasing projects that are sexy or interesting or fashionable, and will get us published, will get us grants, but they're not the real serious questions that our community needs us to engage. And I think that's a fair charge. And that's a kind of conflict of interest we should be worried about, and that we should be examining as healthcare ethicists who are responsible to the people we serve.
And so let me follow up, and this makes me think about who we are as PHEs. And is there, and maybe there's nothing, I don't know. I wonder what this means for our field, but what makes us uniquely situated to open up these moral spaces?
Great question. I don't think we are. I don't think we're uniquely situated. And I think that one of the things that's a strength of bioethics is that we've resisted the idea that only one kind of disciplinary background prepares you to be a healthcare ethicist, right? I love that about our field. I love that my team contains people with philosophy and theology and legal and social work backgrounds and so forth. It makes it richer. So I don't know what, I think we would struggle to say that we uniquely have certain kinds of skills. I think people of intelligence and goodwill can be taught to be bioethicists, and I think that lots of people in our hospitals are thinking ethically. But what we have is a role that's special, that can open up the moral space, so that when someone calls for an ethics consultation, it becomes a different kind of conversation. And I think we've all experienced that. Clinicians call us. In fact, I had a consult about an hour ago where someone said, I just wanted you to be on the email so that we could have this kind of a conversation. So it isn't just about something purely clinical. It becomes about what we owe each other, or whether we've done well by this unfortunate, this patient's unfortunate case. So I don't know that we're the only people can do it, but we've been given a role. We've been given a platform and an opportunity to shape the conversation. What we haven't done very well, though, is we haven't perfected our elevator speeches so that we can say to people, this is what you expect from us. I always find that the hardest thing in the world. I think I have family members who think I might be a patient ombudsman or, a risk manager, and it's hard. It's hard to explain. And yet people very quick to say something's unethical. It shouldn't be a hard thing to explain. And I think it's because we haven't had good answers to those charges about, ethical imperialism, or why Anne's values or Jason's values, or how we might be constrained in our practice. So I don't know
what is that? It's good. I'm curious what that means then. Why can't my neighbor then? What makes it that my neighbor couldn't, and maybe he can set up an ethics shop, as it were, not saying that that's what we do, but if we set up, why couldn't he set up an ethics shop? And he could, I guess, he could be called and call himself an ethicist and put it himself out there. Is there something that, when you've thought about this work, that makes us different than anybody else? Or maybe the answer is no. Maybe we aren't that different, and maybe that's the problem, Anne, is that we really do think we're different, and the truth is maybe we're not, right? I have some thinking about this. I mean, my sense on this is, I tend to see, it's not always the case, tend to see that people who sit in these roles have certain skills and attributes that enable them to do the work and open the space, right? To certain question asking ability. Does it mean that anyone could set up shop? No, it's a certain set of skills that people have in this space. I think the person who called you today, there probably were unique things that or specific questions that you asked them that you've learned as you've sort of practiced in this space, or learned even before you practice in this space, that some random person couldn't do, but doesn't mean they couldn't learn. So curious your thoughts on that. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I don't know that we're particularly special animals, but I would hope that we have certain skills, certain knowledge, certain attributes that allow people to rely on what we're going to do and have some understanding of what they can hope for with us. I think this is the part we've been bad at. We haven't said, when I call Anne, this is what I'm going to get. This is the kind of work she's going to do. And that what the kinds of skills I'm going to need will be different depending on the kind of case it is, too, by the way.
Exactly. That's right.
Very good, right? At mediating disagreements, for example, in a way that is generous and that can amplify the voices that aren't being heard and so on. That takes practice. It takes training. It takes a certain kind of emotional intelligence that I think can be taught. Maybe not to everyone, but it can be taught. It's not that rare and special. There are, and as you know, I have this topology that I'll inflict on you now. Like, I think there are evocative cases. Those kinds of cases elicit strong feeling. Maybe they're the boundary cases where, Jason, you just remind me of my uncle so-and-so who drives me up a wall, right? And we get called about that. that's a certain kind of skill set, managing that, identifying that, recognizing that. And we can train people to do that. There are morally distressing cases, right, where everybody knows what the right thing is to do. The ethical insight isn't that profound. We say, my God, how can it be the case that we don't have enough shelter beds in a city like this in a cold Canadian winter to effect a safe discharge, right? It's a deeply morally distressing case. You don't have to have special ethical insight to know that. There are people who know it more intimately and know it better than we do, right? So if you call for an ethics consult like that, then what you hope your ethicist can do is help identify that that is the source of the moral injury, that this is the kind of case where you may be involved in reassuring staff that they've done everything they can do to do right by a particular patient, to refer to appropriate resources, but you may not have everything you need. You may not be the community worker or the advocate, but you might identify where someone else is going to be usefully engaged. So I think part of it is identifying the kind of case, so evocative cases morally, and then there are penumbral cases that may actually require a good knowledge of the kinds of precedents, if you like to use the legal analogy, the kind of precedent cases that we all learn as we study bioethics, where we learn the kind of language of ethics that can help people to think their way through these cases. We should know something about the law, which is a kind of a boundary. We should know something about healthcare policy. There's a lot of stuff that we need to know, and it's not all deployed in every kind of case, but we should be competent in those ways. And I would say that the other part is that we have an accountability that not everybody else in the hospital does. And so by virtue of the role itself, we have certain kinds of responsibilities, and our training program should prepare us to step into those roles. And it just takes a lot of time to master it all.
Yeah. Well, so it's a good segue to something else I've been thinking about with your book. This notion you mentioned quite a few times about thinking critically. And so for those PHEs on the video today and the session today, and for those who might watch it afterwards, your thoughts first. I probably will weigh in on this about what do you think ethicists can actually do? You know, is there anything in the work that you've done that where we can improve our ability to sort of think critically, as it were?
That's a hard one for me. That is, and I certainly don't, like I might have when I was very, very young, think sort of philosophy is the queen of all,
of course,
humanities, and we should all just be philosophers. And in fact, most Supreme Court justices aren't either. And to me, that's a source of hope. It's like, yeah, really competent people with integrity can reason well through difficult cases. And I think part of the answer too is to reject this ideal of that solo thinker, the Hercules, who's going to get it right all the time. I think thinking in company with other people who worry about the same kinds of topics that we do is a partial answer to your question. The other part is I would really like to see greater communication between town and gown. Academic bioethicists do great work, and they can think in very careful ways and at length. They have the time enough in the world that maybe Hercules does. We don't. If you have, dozens of cases coming up every week, you don't have time to think deeply about everything or keep abreast of everything in your field. And I would love to see greater exchange of ideas and mutual respect between people who do applied ethics and people who do the longer, more careful thinking in the academy.
Yeah. I think about it oftentimes as a fellowship training program about how we think about, training fellows to think critically. And, we've had a number of round of fellows here. And one of the things that I've seen, or I think I've seen, we'll say, is to train to think critically requires a safe space in which to do that. And usually in newer trainees, that the trying to do that on the fly in the middle of a patient care setting is tough. It's a tough road to sort of go down. And we've attempted to, we've created simulation. We do a lot of simulation training with our fellows, and think if we can create that space to see how they're thinking, how they're reflecting, how they're thinking critically, what kind of questions are they asking, what spaces are they opening up, what things are they seeing that we, in constructing the simulation, didn't see that add to it. I think it's while it may be the learner who, who's the fellow who's learning at the moment, I think there's a broader sort of learning that happens from the team outside looking in, that happens. And then at the end of the day, I believe that thinking critically is a sort of skill that's honed over time, and requires you to just get into the fire and understand that mistakes are going to be made, and transparency is there. I remember my first consult I ever did as a clinical ethicist, and there was a surgeon who wanted us to restrain a patient for a very long time, months, because they had an abdominal wound that they kept picking at. And I can't remember the question I asked, but that surgeon got pretty mad real quick, and let me know that they were mad about what I had said. And I came back and was talking with a mentor of mine, and she said to me, it's going to happen. It's going to happen again. You're never going to have all the right questions. You're never going to be, but the question was a good question to ask, at least to put it on the table. And so, I think about that, and how we think about training programs and what we're doing, what they're doing in master's programs or fellowship training programs, PhD programs, and how we're really prepping people to step into these roles in a future time. I'd want to switch because we have about 2 minutes, which is way insignificant for.
Can I respond though to one little thing, Jason?
Of course, Anne, of course. Yeah, I'd rather you do that than me ask another thought.
No, you said something wonderful there, and that was about creating safe spaces. And sometimes you can feel awfully alone in this work. And it's great if you have a mentor like that. The other thing I know that you believe in, that I do too, is that we need to make it safe space for different kinds of ethicists, that we need to diversify the field so that we can think beyond, the lenses that we bring, the life experience we bring to the table. Because thinking critically doesn't mean thinking alone on Olympus like Hercules, right? It means thinking with people who've seen other things. And I know that's something that fellowship programs can do a whole lot better. So sorry, I know you had another question.
No, so it ties into this. It ties into fellowships. It ties into academic programs. It ties into the work that you're doing. And maybe I'll leave this as the concluding question, and maybe we can both talk about it for a few minutes, and maybe shorten the time that the audience gets to ask questions, but so be it. I wonder what the work of legal theory and the savior that you suggest that it is, means for us in terms, finally, in terms of professionalization of the field. There are lots of critics. You've noted a few of them. There are tons of others. There are critics who may not raise the same questions that some of the critics that you've brought up in the book, but are just I don't want to say antithetical to the profession and the practice, but maybe they are. There are some scholars out there who work in more academic spaces, I think, and sort of are saying, we shouldn't be going down this path of professionalization. And I'm curious what you think the work you have says about going down the path of professionalization.
Oh, so I think you've asked me two different kinds of questions. One about what can legal theory bring, and what do I think about professionalization? I mean, I think about legal theory is that, this collision with legal theory gives us another vocabulary for opening up these questions. And I think I started there, right? And I was thinking about the kinds of language we used to use in legal theory seminar. We worried about the relationship between law morality. We talked about how to adjudicate hard cases. We talked about empirical versus theoretical disagreement. You know, people come to with very different conceptions of how the law ought to be understood. Mm-hmm. The idea that law is a social practice, which means it's going to be reinterpreted over time. Static, right? I think all of these things are really very, very interesting. Understanding the difference between principles and rules. I think about this a lot in our daily work because people treat principles as if they're rules. And it's like, what? Justice isn't binary, you know, there's a whole lot of space there. So that's my answer for legal theory. And I go into that a lot more, as you know. With professionalization, I think people should know what they're getting when they get us. I think they should know that we've had some kind of rigorous training and we know what conflict of interest looks like for us, right? That we understand our obligations. I really see bioethics as a vocation, to be clear. It's a calling in a way. But I do think that things can be taught and that we can be held accountable. And I think it's a damn shame if we don't. You know, and protected title comes with a whole lot of baggage. I get that. But there is no way now that a rogue ethicist can be held accountable because there's no college. There's no one to appeal to. There's no way to say that Anne really was guilty of ethical malpractice in my case, that she did things that no ethicist should ever do. And if I'm a hiring manager, I also may not even know what to look for in an ethicist. And I feel like that seems like pretty important stuff. Like it's pretty high stakes stuff. We should get this right.
Yeah. I think you're right. I'm thinking about this. I think you're right. And I wonder, especially about as a hiring person. So you brought up this idea of the hiring person. And I think the majority of people who are hiring ethicists across at least the United States have no clue what they're hiring. In fact, you can see it when they're hiring on ethicists who come on and then the position continues to be reposted rapidly. You know, it's 3 months in, it's posted again, 3 months in, it's posted again. You know, I've had different organizations reach out to me and ask, you know, what should I be looking for? And I said, well, you probably should have asked somebody else, you know, 10 months ago before you did this, you know, so that you can be looking for that person that you're sort of talking about, right? And I do agree with you, Anne, that I think our field needs to step up and have a lot more accountability about people practicing. You know, I do worry about rogue people setting up shop and practicing ethics and sort of purporting to be something that maybe the rest of the field necessarily isn't. And so what happens to our field when we have those things? So, well, and it's on my clock, at least down here in Atlanta, it is 4:54. We're supposed to give 10 minutes, but we'll maybe give 6 minutes back to the group about it. But I just want to say a few things. Like, Anne, I've really enjoyed our conversations together. I want to say this publicly. I enjoy our friendship, our collaboration, our disagreements, that we're not one and the same. You know that. I've really enjoyed this opportunity to be here with you to talk about your work, to provide some insight on my side and sort of how our differences or alignment is sort of out in the public. And then I think I just want to thank the Joint Center for Bioethics for this opportunity to participate with you on this conversation. So I'll turn it over to you, Anne, and to the group.
Thank you. And if I can, Andrea, I just want to thank everyone here too, because I worried about this. Doing this on YouTube isn't the same as sitting in a seminar room with good colleagues and saying, Anne, you got this wrong. Here's how I'd amend this. But this is kind of the next best thing. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Goodness gracious, on behalf of the JCB, but just personally, this was a wonderful discussion to listen to. I've taken a lot out of it, and I'm sure that other people have or will when they watch this back, certainly. And so, of course, as those who are online know, I believe it's been posted in the chat that if you do have questions or comments that you would like to pass along to Jason and Anne, please feel free to pass them along using the YouTube chat or via email, and that's noted in the chat right now. With about 5 minutes left or so, maybe we can just jump into a couple of questions. One is, do you ever say, and perhaps, I'm sure that both of your perspectives on this would be valued, but and do you ever say that something is blatantly unethical? Or is it problematic to say this as a practicing healthcare ethicist because we have our own values and views? Do you tend to say that something is more or less defensible instead? And then it's noted, it seems plausible that a judge or a literary critic might say that something is blatantly wrong or bad, but perhaps we shouldn't be making these big claims.
Great question. I think you know me well enough to know that I don't run around telling people they're unethical. Typically, I don't recall ever saying that on duty, maybe at home. So I just don't think it's a productive kind of conversation. What I do say, though, is that I don't want to be disingenuous. If you actually asked me, and you were my CEO, and what do you think is the better course? I think it would be appropriate for me to offer my reasons and to offer some sense of the ethical landscape with respect to the kind of question you're asking me about. So it wouldn't be an eccentric view, but if I gave you the landscape and I said, Andrea and other brilliant ethicists hold this contrary view, but here's why I think this is so, and here are my reasons. I think that's practicing with integrity. And as I said to Jason, I think it also depends on the kind of case it is. I would never, ever attempt to say I should substitute my values for those of one of our patients, one of our providers, and so forth. I see Jason's nodding. Maybe he'd like to add something.
No, I think it's an interesting question. And I might disagree with you a little bit here. I actually think I would. If Andrew, if you came to me and said, I'm going to murder this patient in the bed, right? So it depends on the case, but I'm going to murder this patient. Oh, did they ask you to murder them? No, they said they want to live. What about their family? Did their family say to murder them? No, their family said keep them alive. Everybody. What about all the other clinicians? Nope, every other clinician says we should do the things that are going to get them back to their health. But I just still want to murder them. Is that okay? Right? Now, do those cases come in? And of course, very rarely. But
they don't.
I think those are the times where I would maybe argue we ought to say things like, Andrea, I'm sorry, I don't think you ought to kill that person. I don't think you ought to commit murder in this case. I don't think that's ethically justified to do it here, right? That may get me in sort of hot water, of course, in the clinical ethics space, but I do think part of our task is, and as you pointed out, and I think ASBH says this a lot, is setting up guardrails about it. There are times when we say, no, this is not in the acceptable. There's no good argument for any of this, despite what everybody's saying. There's no argument. There's no good argument for you, Andrea, to murder this patient. And I see you wanted to say something.
But that's such a whack case, Jason, that I just don't think it comes out. So, but people may want to recommend something that could be deemed ethical but not lawful. In which case you might say, you would do this at your peril. You might jeopardize your license. I understand you have strong faith. So it's a bigger conversation for sure. And I'm very mindful of the clock with this bomb of a question.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, no, I appreciate both of those perspectives, and I'm sure that anyone watching this certainly will as well. And just to note, yeah, Anne, I certainly have never heard you say, this is unethical, but we also, I don't know if you've been presented with the kind of wild case that Jason put in front of us, but yeah, I really value those thoughts very much. Maybe because it's 5 o'clock on the dot, just very quickly, just in regard to elevator pitches, and maybe this is putting you on the spot, Anne, but just any thoughts you want to share about what we should incorporate in our pitch, or what shouldn't be incorporated?
Oh, goodness. See, this is where I'm weak. I'd have to give that some thought, Andrea. My elevator pitch isn't very strong. I mean, I think I say that I help people think about hard ethical decisions arising in patient care, research, organizational strategy, by identifying some ethical, it's hard to talk about ethics without using the word ethics, but thinking about value, conflict, etc. It's not easy. I don't have a pat answer. I think I respond to the particularities of the case.
Thank you so much. I think that's a perfect note to end on, just being respectful of your and everyone's time. Because it's 5:01, very possible that you'll end up getting questions or comments from folks afterwards. But it is time to draw today's wonderful seminar to a close. So just a couple of quick announcements before I end off by thanking our speakers again. So this was the final seminar of the year, 2023. Our next seminar will take place in the new year on January 10th, 2024, featuring Dr. Eric Matheson, where he will be discussing, and the title is, What Should We Do with Coerced People? To sign up to receive our weekly seminar reminder emails and the event digest emails, please email jcb.info@utoronto.ca. I believe that's being put into the YouTube chat right now. And finally, Anne and Jason, just on behalf of all of us, on behalf of certainly myself, thank you so much for all of the insights that you shared, for offering your perspectives, and for introducing many to your wonderful book. And I will certainly say it's a wonderful, I think, book that will influence the field for years to come. So would highly recommend it. Perhaps I have a conflict of interest I should be declaring, but I do think that it is. Thank you for sharing all of your thoughts and wisdom with us.
Well, thank you.